America's war for independence was tremendously important because it made it possible for a new form of government called democracy to come into the world at a time when almost everyone was still being ruled by kings and queens. The war for independence was a long, hard-fought struggle between the professional army of Britain, the most powerful country on earth, and a raggedy collection of American colonists. It lasted for 8 long years, and by the time the war was over, 27,000 American and 10,000 British soldiers had lost their lives. As the leaves were just changing color in October of 1774, the colonies were experiencing a lot of trouble because of unfair taxation, lack of representation in the British Parliament, and the restriction of colonial freedoms. Even so, less than 1/3 of the colonists really wanted independence from Britain. Nevertheless, the First Continental Congress was meeting that October and was warning people to be prepared to fight if American liberties were not restored. Early in the next year, in 1775, the situation grew worse when the king declared the colony of Massachusetts to be an open rebellion and commanded that Boston's main patriot leaders, Samuel Adams and John Hancock, be arrested for treason. A short time later, soldiers were ordered to seize American weapons and gunpowder being stored in the town of Concord, Massachusetts. The night before the outbreak of the Revolutionary War, the steeple of this Boston church glowed with the light of 2 lanterns. The lights were a signal to the patriots that British troops, known as Redcoats, were coming to search for weapons in Concord by secretly crossing the river to Charlestown. Once they knew which way the Redcoats were coming, 3 riders, including a silversmith named Paul Revere, raced off to warn people along the way. The next morning, here in Lexington, Massachusetts, 70 armed citizens known as Minutemen confronted the Redcoats as they marched toward Concord. No one knows who fired the first shot, but when it was over, 8 Minutemen lay dead. The British troops continued on toward Concord, but when they got here, to the Old North Bridge, more fighting erupted and they retreated back toward Boston. But all the way back, they were fired upon by rebels from behind trees and stone fences. By the time the Battle of Lexington and Concord was over, 250 British soldiers and 90 Americans had been killed or wounded. A few weeks after the outbreak of war, representatives from the 13 colonies formed the Second Continental Congress that would serve as an emergency government throughout the war. While the Second Congress was just getting underway here at the State House in Philadelphia, the war spread as American fighters in the colony of New York captured Fort Ticonderoga. At the same time, armed militias took up positions in the hills around Boston. By the middle of June, Congress had authorized the formation of a Continental Army, and they selected George Washington to be its commander-in-chief. The Battle of Bunker Hill was the second and the bloodiest battle of the Revolutionary War. It started after American militiamen constructed a crude dirt fort at night atop a hill in Charlestown, overlooking Boston's harbor. In the morning, the British began shelling the fort from ships in the harbor and from land batteries in Boston. Soon, Charlestown was burning. Then wave after wave of redcoats attacked. But the poorly equipped Americans didn't start firing until they could see the whites of the enemy's eyes. The battle continued until the militiamen ran out of gunpowder. In the end, the redcoats suffered twice as many casualties as the Americans, but the British still managed to win the bloody Battle of Bunker Hill. A month after the American defeat at Bunker Hill, General Washington took command of the militias around Boston. His plan was to drive the redcoats from the city if Britain refused to accept America's offer of peace. When he learned the king had declared war on all the colonies, Washington went into action. He gave orders to have many cannons brought in from far-off Fort Ticonderoga. But the only way this could be done was to wait for snow in order to drag the heavy guns on sleds to Boston. As this was being done, American troops invaded British Canada, but were defeated when they tried to capture the city of Quebec. By March of 1776, the cannons were in Boston and were pointed directly at the enemy. Realizing their position was hopeless, the British dumped their own cannons into the harbor and sailed off to the safety of Canada. After that, American forces took control of the city. With the arrival of summer in 1776, Thomas Jefferson and other members of a special congressional committee were busy at work writing the Declaration of Independence, America's most famous historical document. They wrote that all men are born with certain God-given rights and are created equal. They describe all the ways that Britain had taken away the rights of the colonists, and they declare that America must be independent to form a new democratic nation. The United States of America was born here, within the walls of the State House of the Colony of Pennsylvania, on the 4th of July, 1776, when the Declaration of Independence was presented to Congress. This room was unusually quiet that day as men stepped forward to sign their names to the document, for all of them realized the great importance and danger of what they were doing. Among the signers of the Declaration of Independence, slavery was a very controversial and confusing issue. For while some hated slavery, others were slave owners. Still others were slave owners who also hated slavery. Thomas Jefferson, for example, had called slavery a cruel war against human nature. Yet both he and George Washington, who also held anti-slavery views, possessed large Virginia plantations and owned hundreds of slaves. The Continental Congress believed that the problem of slavery had to be solved at a later time, because right then the war had to be won and a strong union of states created. Many Americans were just learning that independence had been declared when war broke out in New York and spread to New Jersey and Pennsylvania. It began when British soldiers and hired German troops, called Hessians, assembled to attack New York City. After a lot of fighting, British forces took control of the city and chased Washington's army across New Jersey into Pennsylvania. But near here, on Christmas night in 1776, Washington and his men went on the offensive. They crossed the icy Delaware River and slipped back into New Jersey. With the element of surprise on their side, American forces went on to win important battles at Trenton and nearby Princeton. The next summer, a huge enemy force invaded New York from Canada. At the same time, a second British force attacked from the opposite direction and defeated Washington's army in Pennsylvania in a battle at Brandywine Creek. From there, the British marched on and took Philadelphia, America's capital city. But up north in New York, near the town of Saratoga, things went much better for the United States because forces led by General Horatio Gates beat the British twice and captured a large number of enemy soldiers. The Saratoga victories were very important. In fact, because of them, France decided to enter the war on the side of the United States. 2 months after the fighting at Saratoga, Washington began to set up his winter encampment here at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, about a day's ride from Philadelphia. Soldiers built rows of log cabins like these, and in a short time, the Valley Forge encampment became the second largest city in the United States, with a population of 12,000 men. Although the cabins were very crowded inside, they provided shelter from the snow and wind. But Washington's men still suffered severe hardships most of that winter because they lacked adequate food, shoes, and clothing. And by spring, 2,000 soldiers had died. However, some good happened at Valley Forge as well, for a German officer named Baron von Steuben drilled and trained the American troops until they became a much more disciplined and determined fighting force. In 1778, the summer after Valley Forge, the British undertook a major military campaign in the southern states, where a lot of people were against independence. So the British abandoned Philadelphia, and soon warfare ended in the north. Late in December of 1778, the King's forces seized Savannah, Georgia, and soon took control of the whole state. The year 1779, as well as most of 1780, were very bad for the United States because they suffered a string of bitter defeats in the South. Eventually, the Americans started to win again, but they could not stop the British from invading Virginia. By October of 1781, a large force of British troops, led by General Cornwallis, had reached Yorktown, Virginia, an old tobacco port near the Chesapeake Bay, where the last battle of the Revolutionary War was to be fought. On the outskirts of Yorktown, the British set up an encampment, positioned their weapons, and built walls and trenches while they waited for more supplies and troops to arrive in ships from New York. While this was going on, Washington's army and 5,000 French troops marched south to Virginia. When Washington reached Yorktown, he learned some very good news. A French fleet had battled the ships coming to help the enemy's army and had forced them to turn back. This meant the British were trapped and outnumbered. Besides that, relentless shelling by American and French troops was causing them very heavy casualties. It was such a hopeless situation for the British that on October 19, 1781, the shooting stopped and they surrendered. The battlefield here at Yorktown witnessed the last big conflict of the Revolutionary War, but the war did not officially end until 1783, when a peace treaty was approved in which Great Britain formally recognized the independence of the United States of America. True or false? The first battle of the Revolutionary War was fought in Massachusetts. True or false? In 1774, most Americans didn't want independence from Great Britain. True or false? The Declaration of Independence was written by George Washington. True or false? Soldiers from both Germany and France fought in the Revolutionary War. True or false? The Battle of Bunker Hill was the bloodiest of the entire Revolutionary War.